Hey folks, welcome to the channel Thinking Theology. I'm Don. If you're new to the channel, first, welcome. Secondly, I don't establish a theology here. I don't, contrary to what the channel name might give the impression of, this is just a channel dedicated to me assessing arguments made by religionists, Christians, Jews, atheists, and just saying whether or not I think the arguments make sense, not whether I believe them. Arguments can make sense. There's a difference in philosophy and logic between a sound argument and a valid argument and so on, which I won't get into the nuances of, but I do employ that background that I've got, a philosophy background, to assessing the various arguments. I couldn't care less if you're an atheist or if you're a hardcore Christian or Jew or Muslim. It doesn't change my life at all. But I just look at the arguments being made and say, does that make sense? We're going to be looking at Bart Ehrman today, and he is stating that 1 John 5:7 is the verse I believe he's going to be looking at, but that the one verse that mentions the doctrine of the Trinity in the Bible, it doesn't use the word Trinity is not in the Bible. Most Christians or Jews, anybody would know that who studied even a little bit of biblical some of the texts. But 1 John 5:7 is the one that has been primarily used to support Trinitarian dogma. Now, I don't care if people are Trinitarians or not. I like people who are kind, thoughtful, reasonable, who also recognize that they themselves might be wrong on anything, because I live my life that way as well. Like, I could be wrong on anything that I think. So if you make a better argument for it, I'll go with your argument. I don't care who you are. If an argument's better than mine, I'm going with yours. So let's see what Bart's got to say here. Oh yeah, let me put on my trusty headphones. Here we go.
One passage in particular is kind of interesting that is directly related to Christian doctrine, is that the doctrine of the Trinity is not explicitly taught in any passage of the Bible. In other words, the doctrine that there are three gods. Wrong
lingo.
Sorry. Dan Brown speaking once more. The doctrine that there's one God manifest in three persons, that these three persons are each individually completely God, but there's only one God. Not three gods, but one God, but not one person, three persons. So the three in one. This is not taught in any passage of the Bible except 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, in which the author says that there are three witnesses in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. That's a pretty explicit statement about the Trinity. Now, there's an interesting story about this passage because it doesn't show up in the Greek manuscripts of 1 John. It's in the Latin manuscripts of 1 John. When the first scholar to put together a printed Greek New Testament produced his work, this was Erasmus, who was a humanist from Rotterdam. In the year 1516, he put together for the first time the printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He didn't include the verse, because it wasn't in the manuscripts that he had. And the Latin theologians went ballistic. And according to the story that circulated, Erasmus said, look, it's not in any of the Greek manuscripts. And they said, yes, but it's part of the church's doctrine. You've gotten rid of the Trinity. And Erasmus said, look, if you can produce a Greek manuscript that has it in it, I'll include it in my next edition. And so they produced a Greek manuscript. And so they copied out a Greek, somebody copied out a Greek, and when they got to that point, they translated the Latin back into Greek, stuck it in, and Erasmus was true to his word and included that in his next edition. And it was on the basis of that edition that the King James Bible translators put the Bible into English. So that's why the verse showed up in the King James translation.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's interesting. I've studied this doctrine. I wrote a book, had a book published in 1998 by International Scholars Publications. It's now out of print, but it was 550 pages, and it was on this subject of the Unitarian Trinitarian debate. And my understanding was Martin Luther was also similarly convinced that that verse was in none of the original text, none of the original manuscripts, that he had said that if you can produce one as well, similar to this story here, where if you show me somewhere a Bible in which 1 John 5:7 exists, that it's in there, that language is in it, I'll put it in mine. And I believe Valentinus, and that's where the Latin comes in. Valentinus, I think, this is just by memory from 20 or 30 years ago, that he was a biblical scholar of ill repute, and he had it in his. And so, true to Martin Luther's word, he put it in his, and so that's how it wound up in the texts. The King James Version has it in italics and all this. So it's one of these things where if you're going to employ a certain sense of reason, some rules, so we call it common sense or what have you, I understand very well those who disavow Trinitarian dogma. That's not to say that they don't hold Jesus in extraordinarily high esteem. They may consider him to be just second only to the Father in their theology in terms of, say, authority or ultimate worship. And this is where partly where some atheists come down on it when they look at the argumentation here being made in favor of Trinitarian dogma, not by Bart. He doesn't believe this. But that the doctrine of the Trinity, that there are three persons in the Godhead. Now that alone is like, okay, where are we going with this? This is unusual. And that each of the persons is fully God. But there are not three gods. There's still only one God. And then, he alluded to, three natures in one person. It's actually Jesus has a dual nature. That's Trinitarian theology, that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. That's his dual nature. And that when he said things like, my Father is greater than I, he was saying that in his capacity as a man, but not as God. As God, he's fully equal with the Father. And this is where people say, you're just using words that don't have any meaning. Like when we say that somebody is fully God, or that there are three persons that are fully God, but there are not three gods, you say, okay. Then ultimately people will say, well, you just have to believe it. You just have to take it on faith. And this is where the notion of faith gets a bad name, because to me, faith, and I don't mean theological faith, I mean belief in anything, even if it's in science, scientific principles, mathematical principles. There's got to be a logic behind it. There's got to be something that says, all right, I can't disprove that there's a God. I actually believe that matter came from somewhere. Let's say this is the argument. Well, you're still going to use words according to their normal sense. That's just how we use words. That's how we develop arguments. That's how we go from one premise to the next and establish a nexus between those premises and then come up with a conclusion. And absent words that have identifiable meanings, you can't really come up with a sense of logic. And that's why I've even named the channel Thinking Theology, because arguments need to be made sense of. You've got to have some basis for them. And that's where I say certain things make sense, some don't. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean I believe it. I may say, all right, so far your argument, I don't see big problems with it, but you've got to go further than what you've got, or you've got to review the premises involved. Because your argument might be sound, but it might be invalid. It may not be a valid argument. But all of that said, 1 John 5:7 was not in the original text. It's in some of the Bibles, and that's the only one that mentions the three co-equal, co-eternal persons in the Godhead, or in the, supposed Godhead. So, as I've said, it doesn't matter to me what somebody believes, because I'll handle my own beliefs and doubts. Others can handle their beliefs and doubts. I think it's just kind of better if we're all just kind of pretty chill with one another. You believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe, but it doesn't mean we have to be dicks to or jackasses to each other. So there it is. All right, guys, leave your comments. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you on another video. Keep thinking theology.